is part of the This session is part of the virtual session of the 4th International Conference on Environmental Peacebuilding. My name is Octavio Goyo. I'm a visiting attorney at the Environmental Law Institute and chair of the Africa Interest Group of the Environmental Peacebuilding Association. It is my pleasure to serve as the chair of this session. Before we begin, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to Carlos Brook, President of the Environmental Peacebuilding Association, the conference organizers, and the secretary team for their support in planning this session. In particular, I would like to thank Angela Minhiu and Mara Puzik for their assistance throughout the process. We also appreciate the support of our technical team. Today we have Eva Sikamaki. She's taking care of the technical aspect of our session. So let me briefly introduce the theme of today's session. This session explores emerging frontiers in environmental peacebuilding by examining how natural resource governance, restorative and transitional justice, and ecological relationality challenge conventional peacebuilding approaches and open new pathways towards more inclusive and sustainable peace. So our focal question is, what role can natural resources, justice, and ecological stewardship play in building durable peace? So we expect by the end of this session, participants should understand how natural resource management, transitional and restorative justice, and ecological relationality contribute to more inclusive and effective environmental peacebuilding initiatives. The session will consist of 3 parts. First, we will hear 3 presentations, each lasting approximately 10 minutes. Second, we will move into a moderated panel discussion where we will engage the speakers in a conversation about the key themes emerging from their presentations. Third, we will open the floor for the audience questions and discussion before concluding with the closing remarks. To ensure that we have sufficient time for discussion and audience engagement, I will keep us on schedule. If any speakers exceed the allotted time, I will gently ask them to conclude their remarks. So we are fortunate to have 3 outstanding speakers with us. First, Alicia Law is an incoming PhD student at Monash University, where I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing correctly the university name, Monash University, where she will research more than human narratives and climate and environmental change. She holds a Master of Global Affairs from the University of Notre Dame, and her research has explored the inclusion of more than human victims in Colombia's transitional justice process and the relationship between ecological perspectives and peace building. Second, Estelle Kegep is a forest and environmental specialist whose work focuses on the intersection of the environmental management and peace building. She serves as a capacity building specialist of the TR project in the Central African Republic. She holds master's degree in environmental and forestry from the University of Trees and Peace and Conflict and Security from the Open University of Catalonia. Her professional and academic interests focus on integrating environmental dimensions in conflict prevention, management, and resolution. Third, Dr. Dalia Simangan is Associate Professor of International Relations at Hiroshima University. Her research examines post-conflict reconstruction and peace building to critical and qualitative approach. In 2025, she received the Peace Emerging Scholar Award from the International Study Association's Peace Session. She holds a PhD in International Political and Strategic Studies from the Australian National University. We will begin with Alicia Law, followed by Estella Kegep, and then Dr. Dalia Simangan. Alicia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Octavio. Very excited for today's presentations. So today I'll be speaking about more than human entanglements in conflict and peace building, including some lessons from Colombia's peace processes. And to give an outline of today's presentation, I'll be providing some context on the research I conducted, including the methods used, a very brief run through of the main points of transitional justice in Colombia in the 2016 peace agreement, before touching briefly on post-humanism and more than human in transitional justice processes. I will draw on three case studies from the region of Montes de Maria, using them to characterize the environment of more than human as an agent in peace building before moving to some questions for further exploration. And throughout this presentation, the thread that we will follow will go from how the more than human has been excluded to Colombia's innovation in accrediting more than humans as victims of armed conflict, and finally a call for more than humans to also be recognized as agents in peace building. This research was conducted during my master's in peace studies at Notre Dame's Koch Institute for International Peace Studies between 2022 and 2024. I spent 6 months in Colombia from July to December in 2023, based in Bogota and traveling to Sincelejo to observe the work of San Bernardo Paz, a grassroots peacebuilding organization. My presentation draws on archival research across legal sources, national institutions, and community initiatives, as well as participant observation and autoethnography while accompanying San Bernardo Paz's work in the Montes de Maria region. So very quickly highlighting the main points of the peace process, the government of Colombia and FARC, one of the largest guerrilla group in Colombia before the peace agreement, they signed the final agreement in 2016, ending the world's longest running internal armed conflict. The internal armed conflict was devastatingly destructive of human lives, the country's social fabric, and also the environment, with mass atrocities and human rights violations committed by public forces, guerrilla groups, paramilitaries, and other armed organizations. The peace agreement included the establishment of a transitional justice tribunal, the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, which I will refer to by its Spanish acronym as the HAP, which has been tasked to examine the crimes committed in the context of the armed conflict, identify those responsible, and to hold them accountable. The system has a restorative aspect as opposed to a more traditional punitive system, and the process is victim-centered, aiming to repair the harms done to victims while also holding those responsible accountable for the harms done. So, transitional justice has been criticized for being anthropocentric. Hierarchies of victimhood prioritize harm to humans over environmental or more than human entities. In these processes, the environment is often seen as a disputed resource or a set of conflict. However, multiple scholars, including Colombian anthropologists Cristina Leons, Daniel Ruiz Serna, and Alejandro Castillo Cueja, have called for the decolonization of transitional justice, including to expand the conception of victimhood to include more than humans. So the Colombian peace process has stood out for recognizing the environmental harms of conflict. The peace agreement has been characterized as one of the most environmentally inclusive to date, and its the reforms introduced include addressing access to land, land tenure, land restitution, and rural development. In addition, the Truth Commission's final report had 3 chapters addressing territory, including a chapter on the Caribbean region, one on campesinos, and another coming from the voices of nature. So throughout the transitional justice process, the HEP has recognized the environment and more than human entities as victims of conflict. Building on a series of legal innovations since 1991, the HEP expanded the definition of victimhood to include Afro-descendant and indigenous worldviews. The HEP's macro cases, which concentrate on specific regions or patterns of violence in Colombia, have included recognizing territories and natural entities as victims. And here I go very briefly to post-human theory because Dalia will be expounding on this in her presentation. Post-human theory is a philosophical framework that problematizes anthropocentrism, or how human beings have been really prioritized in the ways that we look at the world. In post-human theory, human beings are a part of and cannot be understood apart from what they call relational assemblages of entities. And this means that in the context of conflict, posthumanism centers relationships of humans and other than human entanglements in the context of war, decentering humans as the only actors capable of generating, embodying, and making sense of violent actions. And so, in this way of looking at the world, nature is a victim not just because of the human beings that live on it, but in itself and also in connection with the communities and entities that are entangled with it. Having given some background to Colombia's context, very briefly in a discussion of the more than human and posthumanism within transitional justice, I now want to turn to a case study, Montes de Maria, a sub-region in the Caribbean area of Colombia, to show how the more than human is conceived of beyond victimhood and is an actual agent of peace building. As mentioned earlier, during my 6 months in Colombia, I spent a month in Sincelejo, which is a city adjacent to the Montes de Maria region in the Caribbean. Montes de Maria contains parts of the departments of Sucre and Bolivar, and is home to many campesinos or peasants who have a close relationship to land. Many of them were displaced, subject to forced disappearances, murdered, threatened, and persecuted amidst the contestation of territory. And many campesinos in this area have indigenous and Afro-descendant heritage, but identify primarily as campesinos. This is important because while these are not exclusive categories, their categorization limits the access to legal provisions. And while Colombia's recognition of multiculturalism has been a big step for indigenous and Afro-descendant communities, it also delineated the hierarchies of knowledge, putting Afro-descendant and indigenous worldviews above campesino knowledges and livelihoods, which are also very tied to territory but have not been recognized as such by the state. Through my research and from receiving the stories of the people in Montes de Maria, I heard story after story about how the more than human had become witness and victim, even complicit, in the violence of the armed conflict. And in seeking accreditation or recognition as victims in the HEPS processes, these campesinos made it very clear that they also seek recognition for the harm done to territory, land, and water. And to them, recognition and reparations that do not include the more than human will always be inadequate. I can say a lot more about that, but now I want to turn to how my research points to the environmental, the more than human itself, as an agent in peace building. While in Sincelejo, I lived on Finca Villa Barbara, or the farm with the campesino couple, who had been displaced from the neighboring department and came to seek refuge at the finca, which had been a sanctuary of peace during the conflict. Through sharing their daily routines, I learned about the slow rebuilding of life and relations to land. They farmed rice, corn, yams, plantains, avocados, mangoes, pumpkins, and beans, and have raised children and now grandchildren, including a granddaughter who's the first in their family to graduate from college. Over generations, they have, in tandem with the land, cultivated a sense of safety and grounding. The wife, Malcolm Maria, said that through this cultivation of relationships and stability, she has now found a place there where she can sleep soundly and find peace after struggling with the trauma of an attack on her husband and having to flee their home with the children in the dead of night 17 years ago. The finca has also become a safe place for community members across the region together. On Sundays, they come and sit by the kitchen drinking coffee, picking oranges from the orchard, and weaving relationships between themselves. The finca has become a site for ecological revival as well. When the couple first arrived on the property, the land was barren. They described the land as pelado, 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 peeled bare, desiccated, and dry. Now it has been regenerated as lush and green, reforested, and a source of water amidst the dry Caribbean region. One of the residents is part of a network of agricultural and botany enthusiasts in Colombia and has been working to re-establish endangered plants and fruit species here. The regeneration of land is also relevant to the second case study, Escuela en el Bosque, or Forest School, which takes place every other Saturday morning on the finca. Depending on the weather, 10 to 20 children come to the farm, sometimes traveling for hours on foot to attend. These are the children of campesino families who have been widely displaced through violence, land grabbing, or being pressured to sell to landowners, including cattle ranchers and large-scale plantation owners. As a result, the relationship to land has been transformed in younger generations, where land is now seen solely as an economic resource. And so a teacher has been leading classes, bringing in practices of eco-spirituality, eco-psychology, and learning from and with the forest, teaching the children to respond to the more than human, to themselves, to their communities with love and care, and establish the relations that have been broken by conflict in the region's extractive economic model. The third account, Vidas Ecológicas, or ecological protectors, are a group of youth from the region who have been working on peace building. And in 2016, they embarked on an 18-day walk tracing the Palenquillo, a river from its source in a bat cave all the way to the Caribbean coast. They walked along the stream's contours, observing the landscape, the animals, the ways that the environment had been damaged. And this process was a means of embodied learning for the youth as they experienced the stream as a living being, the interactions between their bodies and the water, and the emotional changes that came with them. They also were able to move to different villages and talk to elders and residents, learning more about the conflict and how how the environment had been affected by it. And through this walking in a region where movement ceased because of the fear of walking to enemy lines, walking is radical in re-establishing connections between divided and hostile spaces, and it's been part of the youth's development of their own ethic of peacebuilding. And so, to summarize and to end off, as has been conveyed by the community leaders and through my own observations, these case studies in Montesquieu illustrate the agency of more than humans as part of the process of building peace. The philosopher Karen Barat calls this interaction within and between these entities inverse entanglements to become part of the world in its becoming and the building of peace. And so in all of these cases, I see the more than human. Think of Via Barbara, the stream, the forests, all containing the conditions for the interactions wherein campesinos are preserving and passing on this connection that they have to territory, or even regenerating it where it's been lost. And so the more than human is not just the subject of rights or an entity that is experiencing harm, but active agents in peace building. I can go into the implications for transitional justice later in the presentation, but I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Alicia. Now, Estelle. Estelle. Estelle, the floor is yours.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Octavio, for giving me the floor. I would like to start by acknowledge my two supervisors, Dr. Sonwa and Dr. Luis Antonio Gonzalez, for their ability to mentor me during this research project. We can see, according to UNEP, that more than 30% of conflict, intra-conflict has been linked to natural resources management. And according to, it has been exacerbated by the law of sharing of natural resources management. So the International Peace Institute has shown a mapping of mineral concession and hunting protected area together, pointing the cutting area of natural resources exploitation, and they are associated with conflict in Central African Republic. And in CAR, the paradox is that even though the conflict is the country is rich in natural resources, is among the poorest economies in the world. So in terms of introduction, on the last 30 years of peacekeeping presence in CAR, we can split it from the stage of 2 to 10 years each, and we can witness more than one peacekeeping initiative supported by several actors with sometimes or less strategic interest to address natural resources management issue. For instance, Ms. Barb Minuka focused narrowly on urban displacement and political stabilization, but the mining region has been neglected, and which leads to the use of diamonds to finance the conflict in CAR. So the regional forces like Miko Parks lack a manpower, logistic, and mandate to protect the state authorities into these heavily militarized mining zones. And that is the cornerstone of natural resources management in peace operation in Central African Republic. So assuming that natural resources management can play a significant role in peacekeeping initiatives, success, and considering that natural resources has an incidence in conflict in CAR, our research is targeting to understand how far natural resources management in peace building contribute to the stability in CAR. And we focus to identify the contributors, core contributors enabling natural resources to build peace and their impact on the relevant dimension in the peacekeeping, peace building process framework. So our sample, as we can see, is the impact of natural resources management on peacekeeping operation. And we decided to use the spider method oriented to qualitative research. And our method focused on this review of existing documentation and then oriented interview with the key informant specialized institution. Why we were interested in inclusive qualitative analysis from perception to affected population, fields on trends has been the main concern during this research. We found that Afghanistan and Sierra Leone are the main key takeaway that we can have in order to implement or duplicate the initiatives in CAR regarding the link between natural resources management and peace building. And in these countries, mainstreaming natural resources management and peace building consisted in four key elements. The one is the improve government and stability, followed by for a policy grounded on technologies transfer and foster productivity to target resources. Then the improvement of transboundary resources management, and lastly, the moderate of extensive use of energy and water resources. Complementary to existing priorities of standard peacebuilding initiatives, forest, land, water were considered factors of natural resources management in CAR, preventing resources scarcity, cutting of illegal trade, and these resources and reconstruction of settled local economy and livelihood remain the three main constraints to be considered. So we can see regarding the economic stability that the two contributors of growth domestic product in CAR are forest and livestock. Forest and livestock contribute respectively from 30 to 2%. And we can see that the war, the tax has been tax revenue has been reduced due to the crisis. So natural resources management impact on social state stability in CAR and on 14 social stability according to Fry's and phases. We emphasize on the 3-1, the social stability, social abnormality, accountability, and social dynamism as the most significant drivers of stabilities. So many initiatives have been implemented by organizations on the field to address a conflict linked to natural resources management, and some focus on promoting transparent state taxes, while others focus on sharing revenue directly with local communities. So to conclude, we notice that environmental peace building is a key component for peace building, and Sierra Leone and Afghanistan lessons learned provide enough takeaway element in terms of environmental cooperation that could significantly prevent and reduce conflict in Central African Republic. Thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you, Estella. Now, Dr. Dalia, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Octavio. Let me share my slides. And thank you to the attendees for joining us in this session. My presentation today is based on a working paper that critiques the generally anthropocentric or human-centric approaches to justice and reconciliation, especially in the context of post-conflict peace building. And based on these critiques, I aim to theorize ecological relationality as a concept by drawing on discussions of ecological justice and the critical Anthropocene discourse. And I hope that by presenting this concept, I would like to invite thoughts on how to deploy it in practice. And I'm glad that Estelle and Alethea were able to provide some examples from their case studies. The primary motivation behind this paper and this presentation is really a sense of frustration that despite this awareness and recognition of the environmental costs of conflict, environmental protection remains collateral damage in times of war and also an afterthought in post-war or post-conflict reconstruction. Here in the first photo, the destructive effects of Agent Orange in Vietnam led to the term ecocide. And even though this term had led to international legal and academic debates on what constitutes it, a few countries criminalize this deliberate acts of environmental harm. And Colombia is actually one of the countries that criminalize this. The term ecocide has also been used to characterize the environmental impacts of the ongoing civil war in Sudan, as in the second photo that you see. In Sudan, both forces are fighting over control of gold mines and oil installations to fund their operations, and they have been destroying water infrastructure and public buildings along the Nile, which is Khartoum's only source of water. But it is now polluted with hazardous materials and microplastics. And the same is the case in Palestine in the third photo. On top of the direct environmental impacts of artillery fires and bombardments, there is also severe contamination of fresh water sources in Gaza, leading to food security and health risks among the population there. And what happens when the conflict ends? Unfortunately, similar problems can be observed. And we have seen in other cases of post-conflict peace building. We have learned in the previous Alethea's presentation that state-level conflict has ended in Colombia, and despite the ongoing positive developments that she showed us, there's still several incidences of localized forms of violence carried out by smaller groups against vulnerable populations, including indigenous communities. And these communities commonly live in ecologically valuable areas. Continued illegal mining activities are clearing the forest and killing marine life, which remains a concern given the country's history of natural resource-funded conflicts. In Nepal, the signing of the peace accord in 2016 ended the civil war, and it was good that the agreement actually contained provisions on how to address problems of minority groups, including women, indigenous populations, and other ethnic minorities. But even with political reforms, there are still problems because these communities continue to experience marginalization, especially when it comes to access to resources, including water and forests. And water and forests are very abundant in Nepal. And on the third photo, in Timor-Leste, or East Timor, after the referendum, the UN, the United Nations, supported community-level programs, including water provision. But these programs miss that opportunity of promoting social cohesion because they failed to include women in these programs. And these are just but a few cases that demonstrate what Tobias Ide calls the dark side of environmental peace building, or the unintended consequences of environmental peace building. And I also think that in all these cases, environmental peace building remains fundamentally anthropocentric, ultimately undermining peace and the environment. And environmental protection and restoration serve the purpose of providing services to human populations. And this is a narrow approach that I argue is incompatible with the challenges in the Anthropocene. The Anthropocene is the proposed epoch marking the planetary impact of human activities. It is also characterized by polycrisis or interconnected crisis. For example, resource scarcity or resource abundance resulting from climate change, environmental degradation, and energy transitions could lead to competition and social unrest, including in areas hosting displaced populations. And these environmental changes, in turn, shift political landscapes, as seen in geoeconomics of decarbonization and even the geopolitics of climate action. In this case, the Anthropocene is a contextual backdrop. I often use it as a contextual backdrop, reminding us not just of the human-induced causes of these environmental problems, but also how entangled these consequences are. The pursuit of human development has led to environmental issues. Meanwhile, the pursuit of state security has justified nuclear proliferation despite its potential for widespread social and environmental destruction. And this anthropocentric and state-centric basis for peace and development are pushing the Earth system to dangerous levels, threatening humans and other living beings. And for these reasons, peace and peace building in the Anthropocene demand a departure from anthropocentric, territorial, and linear approaches. And this departure challenges the conventional understanding, especially very prominent in the current liberal international order, that security is anchored on state institutions, that development is predicated on economic growth, and justice and reconciliation are only for humans. And I think here's where the concept of ecological relationality may come in. It expands our conception of political agency to include more than human nature, because generally speaking, victimhood and vulnerability are often understood as exclusively human experiences. And here I borrow Dreisig and Pickering's concept of formative agents, or those who give form to what justice, sustainability, and related concepts should mean in practice. And this concept of agency includes those of the most vulnerable, or those who have the moral authority because they bear the greatest burden when ecological systems collapse. In this conceptualization, agency is tied not just to the capacity to act, but also to vulnerability when there is failure to act. So this vulnerability is intrinsic in an entangled agency, and ecological relationality draws on this expanded notion of agency and the moral imperative arising from vulnerability. An expanded notion of vulnerability is also key to bridging environmental justice and ecological justice. Maybe a lot of us know these two concepts. According to David Schlossberg, environmental justice advocates more for the social world, while ecological justice focuses more on the natural world. And this differentiation reflects once again that separation between humans and the rest of nature, which is one of the ontologies that led to the Anthropocene. In multiple worlds of entangled agencies, justice must converge these social and natural worlds, because one will not be attainable without the other. And this convergence of vulnerabilities resonates with the concept of multi-species justice. To quote Chakert and colleagues here, multi-species justice is about decentering the human and recognizing the everyday interactions that bind individuals and societies to networks of close and distant others, including other people and more than human beings. And according to Chow and Seller-Mayer, it is not simply the delivery of Western legal models and practices of justice to other living beings. It is the recognition that other living beings have their agencies and their vulnerabilities, etc. And they also have the lifeways that are distinct but ecologically situated. And in this age of polycrisis, in this Anthropocene epoch, multi-species justice is a suitable lens for multiple worlds of entangled agencies and shared vulnerabilities. So ecological relationality also expands temporal and spatial dimensions of ecological justice, borrowing MacDonald's concept of ecological security here. Ecological justice is for all living beings, past, present, and future. And it is also important to note here what Fagan has argued, and that is that the Anthropocene carries with it colonial legacies that contribute to historical injustices and present vulnerabilities. And this consideration support the need for us to really rethink justice. So to summarize, this is a photo of one of the trees that survived the bombing of Hiroshima, and actually the castle behind it was destroyed during the bombing. So just to summarize, ecological relationality expands the notion of justice to include more than human nature, considers vulnerability as an imperative of this agency, and extends the temporality and spatiality of both agency and vulnerability. For post-conflict peacebuilding, it is an invitation to explore alternative ways to provide security, to promote development, and to pursue justice and reconciliation. It prompts a reimagining of security that is more compatible with relationality rather than territoriality, development that cultivates care economies rather than just production, and justice and reconciliation for and with other living beings. Thank you so much for your attention, and I look forward to our discussion.
That's great. Thank you to our three presenters for sharing your insightful work. Before we move into the more specific questions, I would like to begin with a foundational question. As some members of our audience may be new in the field of environmental peace building, for audience members who may be unfamiliar with the environmental peace building, how would you explain the relationship between the environment and natural resources on the one hand and peace building on the other? Why do environmental considerations matter for building sustainable peace? Dr. Talia, let's start with you and Stella, and Alicia.
Yeah, I think for those who are not familiar with the term, it's really if I would probably consider a subfield or a subdiscipline really of peace building, in which environmental protection, such as environmental protection, resource management, even disaster risk reduction and management prevention, all of this set of practices that could contribute to social cohesion and therefore peace. So that is I think, the gist of environmental peace building. And what's unique about environmental peace building as a field of study is that it has a very clear connection to the environment. In which peace building, as traditionally understood, is very much on, state security and very much focused on how human societies experience or build peace. But in this context, it really highlights the role of the environment and especially natural resources. And I think I just want to highlight that in the past, environmental peace building was really more of focus on interstate peace building dynamics, but now we are seeing a lot of this local dimension or local levels of environmental peace building.
That's great. Thank you. So,
Estelle, would you like to go? If not, I can also
yeah,
chip in.
Estelle?
No, you can move forward, Aliti.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, thank you. And thanks, Dahlia. I think that's a very comprehensive overview of environmental peace building. And to add to that, I think that it's coming from a post-human perspective. It's also actually the separation of human and non-human, the living and non-living, which is part of the colonial legacy that has been a root of conflict and this modern capitalist society that we live in. So I think with environmental peace building, we traditionally think about conflict for resources like oil, which is very relevant now, critical minerals for the just transition, gold, water, and timber. All of these conflict over these resources have driven long protracted conflicts. And then we also look at how war impacts the environment, as Dala illustrated, through pollution, destruction of ecosystems and biodiversity. And I think when it comes to like the human aspects of peace building, those that often tend to the land and have close relationships to where these natural resources are concentrated are often also the more vulnerable, marginalized groups that are especially affected by violence, whether it's physical and direct violence through conflict or the more structural forms of violence enacted by the state. And I think relevant to the Anthropocene and peace building in this times, climate change has also been a driver and multiplier of conflict. And in the Colombian case, for example, in the Caribbean region, the the increasing drought in the region has led to water wars, the sort of establishment of a water mafia that's controlling water resources, which then leads to violence in local communities and reproduces existing vulnerabilities. And so if we're looking at sustainable peace in the environment, I think we have to take into account environmental considerations, both as a driver of conflict, but also because justice, including economic, racial, and cultural and epistemic justice, has to take into account the worldviews of communities that live very closely with and in relationship with the environment.
Great. Thank you.
Okay, for me, I will take over regarding the response. I think environmental peace building is a clear demonstration of a nexus between peace and development, because usually when peacekeeping missions arrive on the field, they are used to focus on the direct needs, which is more pretty fair. But environmental peace buildings register himself is a long-term process in order to stabilize and to really bring the nexus between peace and development. As I've said in my presentation, the different peacekeeping missions in Bangui have not really addressed, the environmental peace building, but we're focused only on environmental management in the midst of peacekeeping missions. So environmental peace building is a really demonstration of the nexus between peace and between conflict and development. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Esther.
Mhm.
Well, now I am African. I'm originally from Angola, and so in Africa there is a concept, as a popular word, a popular term, Ubuntu. So many transitional justice mechanisms are based on legal and institutional framework that originated in Western traditions. South Africa's use of Ubuntu is often cited as an example of a culturally grounded approach to restorative justice. So, for those who are not familiar with the term Ubuntu, Ubuntu is an ancient African philosophy of life and principle. I can summarize it in two words. Obviously, there's no consensus in terms of the definition of the term, but in two words, that's what I usually try to summarize the Ubuntu is uh, humaneness and collectiveness. So this is the idea of the essence of Ubuntu related to these two concepts, and this spread out to all Africa regions, as you will see this concept in Africa. So in the context you study, are there local cultural principles, indigenous philosophies, or community traditions that shape how people understand justice, reconciliation, and their relationship with the environment? What might formal peace building processes learn from them? So, Alicia, perhaps we can start with you, and Estelle and Dr. Dalia. Please feel free to jump in with examples from Central African Republic or other contexts.
Yeah, thanks, Octavio. And of course, I want to clarify that being not from Colombia, not indigenous, and coming in as a guest and a student, I can share what I've observed that I'm not the authority on the practices there. And as I've mentioned before, in the Colombian setting, I think the more than human, the environment is not just a setting or a set of conflict or something that has spiritual meaning, which is true, but it's not all that it is. The environment is also alive and has shaped the worldviews. And I think for people and communities that are being accredited or admitted to the system as victims, it's important to consider that the individual collective victim isn't like the entire being. For many of them, the territory is also considered part of themselves. And so there's no adequate reparations to the human without also considering reparations to territory. And so the Special Justice Tribunal has taken that into account and has recognized rivers, ecosystems, and sacred sites as victims of the conflict. I think it remains to be seen how they are going to be prosecuting. The sentences for these cases have yet to be released. So I think we will have to wait to see if the concrete outcomes of the process actually recognize these victims in ways that feel effectively restorative. And other practices that I've seen in the communities that I worked with was the use of art, music, and singing. I think you have these like large scale national and institutional processes of giving reparations, which are often like very finance based. They give money, they give land, they give trees. But for a lot of people, it really has been through poetry, art, ritual, where they've been able to express the pain as a community, the pain on behalf of the non-living world, but also as territories of coherent being. An example is a ceremony that took place in the Magdalena River in Colombia. And the river was this river where during the conflict, a lot of bodies after the massacres had been dumped into the river, and so the people considered the river as desecrated. It has been defiled by the violence and the bodies of people. And so they brought music, they brought singing, they brought dancing to the banks of the river, and through that ritual, they they were trying to like heal or sanitize the spirit of the river. And then another example would be through the work I was doing with Duna, a trauma healing organization in Bogota. They work on psychosocial healing and sort of helping victims and perpetrators prepare themselves emotionally before coming to hearings together. And it can often be a very emotionally charged encounter. And so they've been bringing in things like breathwork, mindfulness techniques, but also integrating movement therapies with Afro-Colombian dance techniques because they want to bring in vernacular local movement systems that help people to process the trauma in their body. And so I think it's not just the transitional justice system itself, but maybe the processes that support people moving through the system that can integrate the ways of thinking and living and the cultures that they have.
Thank you. So Estelle?
Okay, in my case, I will emphasize on the initiatives on the field conducted by Search for Common Ground in relation with FAO at the transboundary area between Chad, South Sudan, and Central African Republic. So they have implemented a kind of local conflict for peace where the different elders and heads were joined together and they have been able, to try a kind of discussion, settle some discussion ground on the different conflict linked to the water health. And we have also, which is pretty new, the national reconciliation in Central African Republic, led by MINISCA initiatives, where they have been able, to settle a kind of community of good practices in regions based on the environmental peace building.
Thank you.
Um, Octavio, would you like me to add to that as well, or we can? All right,
Please.
sure. Yeah, I think a lot of this 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 close relationship between human societies and more than human nature, I think we see a lot of this across Asia. I'm from the Philippines, but maybe I'll just give an example of Timor-Leste. They have this traditional reconciliation mechanism called nahibiti, which means opening the mat. For the conflicting parties to come and talk on the mat, they have to call on, the spirits to be part of that conversation. So I think a lot of this like traditional reconciliation mechanisms, I think gaining some attention because some of this very top-down reconciliation mechanisms have failed in many post-conflict or conflict-affected societies. So there's some attention to this, and yeah, that's just one example that I can share as well.
What's the name of it?
It's Nahebiti.
Nahibiti.
Nahebiti, yeah.
Okay. So was it included? Isn't any legal framework on this
Yeah,
term, or is that traditionally used?
it's a customary
Okay.
practice, but recognized by
Because
external peace builders. Yeah.
Because in South Africa, the term Ubuntu was used in the Constitution. It was removed later, but it was used in the Constitution. And today is part of the legal system there and the many other African countries
I
as
see.
well. So it's like an alternative that has been used and is a traditional. So it's a concept. Okay, thank you. So now let's move to individual questions. And feel free, please, if you have any comments, if you want to make any comment, feel free to jump in, please. So if you are in the audience, you wait. We have like 9 minutes or not, around 10 minutes, 11 minutes for you to have the opportunity to ask questions. So you have this opportunity as well. So now I'm going to ask some individual questions based on the presentations. So let's start with Dr. Dalia. So we have heard references to both ecological relationality and ecological justice. How are these concepts connected? And what does ecological relationality help us see that justice framework alone might not fully capture?
Yeah. Thanks, Octavio. Maybe I'll just answer this briefly, that how I theorize ecological relationality really builds on ecological justice. But as I mentioned in the presentation, it aims to bridge that by that separation between environmental justice and ecological justice, bringing them together, but also expanding the temporality and spatiality of of how we understand ecological justice. Temporality meaning the vulnerability of not just at present but also of future generations. So that vulnerability again is linked to agency of present and future generations, both human societies and more than human nature. And also ecological relationality expands the spatiality, meaning it's beyond the state territoriality. Maybe I'll use Alethea's example of the Atrato River in Colombia. For example, if we protect the rights of not just within within the ambit of the Colombian legislation, we also have to kind of connect the international links of illicit mining, right, to those social organizations that might have interest in it beyond the Colombian territory. So in that case, we are expanding vulnerability outside the state territoriality, because that vulnerability could also be exacerbated by what's being experienced within Colombia. So that's how I theorize ecological relationality here.
Thank you. So Alicia, taking that exact idea to the ground, the Colombia case highlights environmental restorative justice within a broader transitional justice framework. Are transitional justice and restorative justice pursuing the same goals, or do they represent different ways of thinking about justice after conflict?
Yeah, great question. I think that they come from two different contexts and have been combined more recently in peace processes. So, transitional justice is usually part of a process of political regime change where there have been human rights abuses in the last regime. And so, this transition is intended to address the injustices committed under a prior regime where like the government, the legal apparatus of the country is also under change. And so, often a special tribunal set up to manage this process. And they utilize criminal prosecutions to identify and hold perpetrators responsible, and often look not just at sort of like the individuals, but those that can be held maximally responsible are the people at the top of the chain who've been responsible for these abuses. And so I think that often has a punitive character, meaning that they use punishment is like punishment that is proportionate to the crime committed. And restorative justice, I think, can be framed within a criticism of the retributive character of transitional justice processes. It comes out of, I think, different settings and maybe has been more commonly used in smaller settings like in schools, in settings of incarceration or prisons, among communities where they are trying to mend and restore relationships between individuals and collectives. And in that context, it emphasizes meeting victims' needs and reestablishing social cohesion, I think really prioritizing the reparation of the victims' harm and restoring their dignity. And of course, in this process, they also aim to hold the perpetrator accountable for what they've committed. But there is a wider goal, I think, the possibility of reincorporating or integrating these perpetrators into society and for society to address the conditions such as the financial, political, and racial injustices that have led the perpetrators committing these acts in the first place. Because in conflict, oftentimes the line between victim and perpetrator is very blurry, and you have people that are complicit in crimes just because of some of the structural entanglements of their positions in society. And so in Colombia specifically, the HEP has adopted a restorative approach to transitional justice. An example of how that works is that for those that are willingly coming forward, accepting responsibility, and telling the truth as the court deems acceptable, they get a maximum sentence of 8 years. So there's a kind of a cap to the punishment they take on. And in addition to that, there's an emphasis on restorative action. So besides maybe like being imprisoned or paying a fine, there's an emphasis on volunteer work, community development work, working on restoring ecosystems and building houses of memory, so that the punishment or the sanction that is imposed on them also goes towards rebuilding the society that they are living in. And that ultimately all of these help to like rebuild the social ties in society, and that these groups ideally are able to live in harmony in the future.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. And now, Estelle, let's look at the. I see you have your baby there. That's wonderful. That's very African. So, Estelle, let's look at the stage level. In the Central African Republic, resource mismanagement drives conflict. How can we shift the perspective of state and international stakeholders so they view natural resource management not just as an economic commodity, but as a core pillar of social justice and reconciliation? Just a mute.
Do you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Yes, based on my research in Central African Republic, natural resources should not only be viewed as an economic activity, but also as a foundation of social justice, peace building, and reconciliation. So conflict related to, for instance, transhumance, poaching, and other form of resources mismanagement often arise from unequal access, to resources. So we have the weak governance and the community exclusion. And in order to shift, the perspective of state and international stakeholders, participation of local communities in decision-making, and integrating natural resources management into peace-building strategies at the top level, for instance, with the peacekeeping mission, which is currently present there. So by treating forests and land, water, and wildlife share assets that support livelihoods, social cohesion, and also dialogue stakeholders can transform resources management from the source of conflict into catalyst of sustainable peace and development in Central African Republic.
That's great. Thank you. We also saw Carol's jumped in. Carol, you are welcome if you want to make any comment or when ask any questions. But meanwhile, let's move on. While you are thinking about it. Okay. Dr. Dalia, building on what Esther said, what are the main barriers to incorporating ecological relationality into legal and policy frameworks? And do existing institutions need to be fundamentally rethought to accommodate it?
Yeah, thanks. I also asked myself the same questions, but unfortunately, I really cannot find the right answers yet. But in my theorization of ecological relationality, I always ask, how will this, be deployed in practice? If, for example, our generally Eurocentric and very liberal institutions, whether at the multilateral or even at the national level, how can we accommodate this so-called multi-species justice, for example? How can we deliver environmental and social justice to multi-species population? And we could probably think of legal personhood here, in which, rivers, lakes, forests, etc., mountains are awarded the same legal rights as a person, and therefore that they have the right to be protected from harm. We have examples in Colombia, right, in the Atrato River again, and in New Zealand and elsewhere. But again, the question is, who gets to communicate and who gets to represent the ecological interests of this forest, these rivers, and these mountains, considering that our institutions are designed by and for human language. So we really need a radical thinking on how we can better not represent, but let the mountains, let the rivers, let the forests speak. Speak for themselves in this pursuit of justice. And I think what we can do as human society is to kind of take a step back, carrying with us our very anthropocentric perspective, because when we carry this perspective to the institutions that we created ourselves, we'll again run the risk of co-opting nature that eventually will again benefit our very anthropocentric interests and could sideline the rights and the protection of more than human nature. Yeah, I don't have the complete answer to this because I'm also searching for the right answer, but I hope our discussion will be able to give me some insights.
That's great. Thank you. Alicia, now this question is related to the concept you addressed, post-humanism, transitional justice. Before asking the question, came another question in my mind here, which is what link would you make this term, post-humanism, transitional justice, and uh, ecological relationality? So I will link two questions. So if institutions do not do need if institutions do need to be rethought, as Dahlia suggests, and transitional justice has traditionally focused only on human victims and institutions, what would you need to change for it to be take non-human nature seriously as part of reconciliation?
Yeah, I will address the pre-question first and the link between posthumanism and ecological relationality. I
Okay.
think there's actually a convergence of many of these lines of thought: posthumanism, ecological relationality, relational ontologies, indigenous wisdom. And I think all of them center on this idea that there is actually no divide between the human and the non-human. We are part of this like, entangled assemblage or combinations of beings that are always in relationship and always acting, interacting, and affecting each other. I think posthumanism comes out of like a more European philosophical lineage of thought, and it brings in quantum physics. It also looks at how I think posthumanism is a little bit broader, and it looks at not just nature and its relationships to the human, but also looks at AI, cyborgs, so like biological research and how the human entity is expanding beyond what we've understood as like this body and self. But I think the ways that we conceive of being a human has expanded, whether it's through nature or technology. And then to the other question on taking the non-human seriously as part of reconciliation, I think first, as I've mentioned, if you're looking at the success of a restorative justice system, it really relies how do you defining success relies on defining or like understanding what has been adequate for the victim as the victim feels satisfied in its repair. And so then I think as Dalia mentioned, how do you ask the question, how do you know when nature is satisfied? How do you listen to that? And so there are new technologies of listening that are emerging, I think different kinds of evidence that are being admitted to courts. And it's still all, I think these are experiments. So again, I don't have clear answers either. I think different courts are experimenting with what can be done. And in the Truth Commission, chapter Voices from Nature, which outlined the harms done to nature and tried to speak on behalf of nature. One of the authors used sound recordings of birdsong and used sound ecology to demonstrate how the landscape has changed, how the density of bird sounds has thinned and become less diverse as conflict has destroyed the environment. Other cases have used geospatial modeling to show how landscapes and agricultural land have changed under paramilitary and plantation control. For example, in an area where campesinos used to be growing bananas on a small scale, when plantations came in, they then moved to monocultures, they transformed the ways that canals moved through the land, and then this led to coastal erosion, led to sea level rises, and then these floods, led eventually to evacuation of campesinos, displacing them from the lands that they've worked on. So I think geospatial techniques like that have been able to be used as evidence. And I think in Colombia, there are judges, especially indigenous judges, that have shown willingness to incorporate new methods. But these are also expensive and need to be funded. So I would say, like, very practically, more funding for these experiments is really helpful. And I think in also recognizing the more than human and taking that seriously in peace building, There's a need to improve and maintain the conditions that preserve the environment as sites and agents of peace building, like, the finca, the farms, and the reserves I mentioned in my case studies, so that the environment is not just addressed as a piecemeal intervention, like a cleanup or a reserve, but there's a true transformation of the economic and environmental structure. So, as an example, in Colombia's peace negotiations, the then president asked for an agreement to not contest Colombia's extractive economic model. And so that was not contested in the terms of the peace agreement. And I think now, especially as climate change, resource extraction, and continued violence put more pressure on already fractured and fragile communities, that really points to the need for the political economy to be transformed. And I think in a way that feels scary and radical for the political elites. Yeah, I will stop there.
Thank you. Thank you. That was great. Thank you. Now, I don't know now if Estelle will be able to talk, but I think we have two options. We can move to the next session because I see she's handled two, and also because of the time here. Yeah, so let's move to the next session. So thank you to all of our panelists for this very rich discussion. We have explored how environmental issues intersect with peace building, justice, and different ways of understanding relationship between people and nature across very different contexts and perspectives. We will now open the floor to audience questions. Please feel free to direct your question to specific panelists or to the panel as a whole. We have about, let's see how much time we have, 22 minutes and for this exchange. And I look forward to your contribution. If you have a question, please use the raise hand feature here on Zoom, or feel free to type your question directly into the chat box. When I call on you, please feel free to unmute your microphone, introduce yourself briefly, name, affiliation, and nationality, and let us know who your question is for. Actually, Eva Sikamaki, our technician, is going to help in this process. If you have a question, she's going to hand that. So, Eva, if you have any question, please let me know. Meanwhile, we do?
I sent one to you by chat.
Okay, so let me take a look. You sent me by chat. Okay. Let's see. Okay, we have a question here from Taznia Prova. I'm wondering if ecological variance matters in peace building between the differences between rivers, forests, and seas. Does the ecological character of the specific form of nature play a role in how peace building is negotiated? Are some natural resources easier to deal with than others? I will open the question to all panelists. Because the person didn't mention any specific person. Yes.
Yeah, I will try to jump on in because if you have
Yes,
seen
yes.
in my studies, I also mentioned the fact that the diamond was founding the conflict in Car, especially the alluvial one. But it's quite difficult, to put a hand on these resources, especially the critical minerals, as their name is trying to emphasize. So it's really tough, to deal with the critical minerals because we have a lot of other process which has been involved, like Kimberley process and all of that in Central African Republic. So since it's a real new field, I think on my point of view that forest and the other resources like poaching and all of that can be more available to be discussed and to settle down. And based on the experience and the benchmark we can have on these three other resources, we can now, try to duplicate the experience on the critical minerals.
That's great.
Thank you.
Any other comment? Or
I don't have a direct response, but I think, yeah, I can share some thoughts.
Mhm.
And I think it's a really interesting question that I want to think about some more. I think in general, I think in the social sciences have a territorial bias or bias to its land, and often I think because like a lot of nation states are land-based, it's I think harder for me to think about examples of peace building that integrates oceans and rivers. I think in many societies, like nomadic, seagoing societies or communities, are often not legitimized and therefore don't have representation. I'm an example, and I'm from Singapore. So in Singapore, we have this indigenous group, the Orang Laut, and people have raised questions about reparations to the Orang Laut because they've been displaced from these islands around Singapore. They've been, yeah, like forced to shore, lost their ways of life, and the question of reparations isn't even possible because they aren't recognized as indigenous people yet. So I think there are so many like intermediate steps that need to be established before maritime communities in the oceans can be seriously integrated into peace building. I think of rivers and seas, there, as Dalia mentioned, with the Treadle River, there's also this transboundary character. And so I think the governance of these resources is a lot more complicated and requires more coordination between countries. For example, the Mekong River in Southeast Asia moves from China to Laos, um, Thailand, and Vietnam. And so that I think that sort of like asymmetries of power there have been very impactful in communities. But there are, I think, bright spots. Recently, there was a Rights of Nature Charter established on the River Wye, so bringing together England and Wales in looking at giving legal personhood to this river and protecting its well-being for future generations. So I think there are some, yeah, again, experiments in this field.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So Dalia, do you want to?
Okay,
Yes.
yeah, just very briefly.
Mhm.
Alethea mentioned about the transboundary nature of the resources. So it actually depends who share the resources, and also who has the interest in exploiting or using, extracting these resources, who has the money to do so, and who has the power and influence, because that could lead to who has the power and influence in supporting the extraction of these resources. But in environmental peace building, and here I will plug one of the projects we have here at Hiroshima University, we have the environmental peace building geoportal, but this is based on published studies, and in environmental peace building, most studies actually focus on water. Maybe I don't know if we have more success when it comes to water resources, or maybe it's just the one that received the most attention. Um, and also how it's used for environmental peace building is how it's managed and distributed equitably. So if like what Estelle mentioned about the critical minerals, I think it's an invitation for us also to look more into other resources other than what's common in the environmental peace building field.
That's great. Thank you. Eva, do you have more questions? If not, I have multiple questions extra here. If you don't
Those were
have it.
all the questions in the Q&A. There's no
Okay.
more.
I only see one here. Let's see if there's more. Is there any question? Let's see if there's more. Okay. Then I will go to my question then. Before going to Carl. Carl might have a beautiful question there. Okay. This is a hot topic, AI. So during our preparation of our for this session, our pre-meeting, we spoke, and I learned that Dr. Dalia, she has been working on something related to AI. So Dalia, to start while you are preparing, you are currently developing an environmental peace building geoportal to map exactly where these activities happen and the local groups leading them. From this big picture view, what has data shown you about how resource management builds peace? First question. Second question, and as a quick follow-up on the tech side, how do we balance using these digital tools when the AI and data centers behind them use up massive amounts of local waters and electricity? So actually, this is a very common, I'll say, complaint that people have about it.
Mm. Yeah, thanks, Octavio. I introduced a little bit about the geoportal, and yes, that collects the geospatial, environmental, and social characteristics of environmental peace building. And really, the intention was to look into local level environmental peace building cases, and we use a mixed method of web scraping and also, as I mentioned earlier, looking into published studies, and also later on we want to incorporate crowdsourcing. And so the geoportal includes the coordinates of where environmental peace building activities take place. And also, as I mentioned, water is the most common resource involved, and the social groups. And based on some of the published studies, local communities actually is the social group that's most commonly involved in environmental peace building. And it also reveals, yeah, that natural resource management is that practice that the outcome of these activities. And it's still under development, and we want to include satellite data like land cover, land change over time, so that we could overlay these environmental changes that might affect, you know, the environmental peace building activities that we have pinpointed in the geoportal. So it is a digital technology, I would say. So it's very new to me as well in my research to use this type of like new technologies for me. But with the AI, I'm just you have already mentioned how water intensive and energy intensive AI, and also the displacement. You know, when you build these data centers, you have communities displaced because you have to build this data center. So for me, really boils down to the ethics of the use of AI. Personally speaking, like it's not my default. I don't. It's not my default because I understand what goes behind it. But I think also the bias of the potential bias of the information that, you know, all this AI and LLM tools could generate, something that we have to be aware of. So personally speaking, for me, AI use is not my default. And although of course we have there's a lot of good potential use for AI, but for this geoportal that we're developing, really some of the technologies we're not touching on the AI yet.
Thank you. Thank you. That's good. I say, it's a promising, because I think today in the world is inevitable. It's an inevitable topic. Yeah. So I wonder if Carl have any comment or any question.
Sure. I'm curious. I find myself listening to a lot of these kind of horizon or frontier theories, and I'm very intrigued by them. As a recovering physicist, some of these theories are more close to my heart than others. I'm wondering what happens when theory meets the reality of this new era, and kind of if the idea is that, well, we're talking about what might shape things in 10 or 30 years, and it takes a while to build that, or if which of these theories, not in principle but in practice, are actually ready for application now, or there might be space or political willingness, or maybe it's not at the national or international levels, but this is stuff that we can do or think about at a more local level. I'm just curious, how do you understand these various theories given the new reality that we're in?
Thank you. It's very insightful. Any comments?
Um, This is not my comment, but I think as well as grappling to peace, I think theory, but also what's happening on the ground in Colombia and the fact that while a lot of these theories are new and radical, they actually are also trying to bring to the fore the ways of like the ontologies and cosmologies of indigenous and Afro-descendant peoples in Colombia. And so it's not a new idea to them, but it's new to this legal system. And what the Colombian anthropologist Pedro Escobar says is that to him, this is the earth speaking, the ways that these indigenous and Afro-descendant traditions and the ways that science and philosophy have come together, to him that is part of the earth's agency expressing itself and affecting the scientists, the legal practitioners, the researchers in being able to speak for her. So maybe that might be a little romanticized to people that aren't from that context, but I found it a really beautiful way of trying to bring coherence to that. And then also, I think the thing that I find difficult at this moment is funding. So the HEP has been very reliant on international multilateral funding, funding from the USAID, and I think even before Trump's administration, funding was already a serious concern in its ability to carry out its scope, and so that has been further compromised. And so I think, as I mentioned earlier, like very practically, I think bringing theory into the future, the present, requires experimentation and risk taking, and it also requires funders that are willing to back that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I will try to join the preoccupation of Mr. Carl. And when I'm looking about Central African Republic, in order to, to put the theory in practice, we need first of all to integrate the environmental peace building in the policy. When I take the case of MINUSCA, I'm seeing that, they are talking about the wide impact. But the wide impact is only focused on the environmental management in the midst of peacekeeping missions. But we don't have activities such as reforestation activities, reach out in order to sensitize on the environmental management and all of this. So bringing into practice means, first of all, to consider environmental peace building or enforce the environmental peace building component at the policy level in the midst of peacekeeping missions, because they are only focused on their impact of their activities on the environmental where in the country where they are involved. But it doesn't focus on the wide impact. I think one of the key points where we can be able to bring the environmental peace building into practice is to more emphasize on the environmental, the wide impact linked to natural resources management, conflict, and also enforce the environmental laws in the term of in the concept of post-conflict. So I think this one of those two elements in the midst of peacekeeping mission, based off what its experience in the Central African Republic, can be much more, foster, capitalized agents or an element to bring peace into, to bring peace building into reality. Thank you, and sorry for my children.
It's okay. I understand. In the African context, that's very common. We have children, and sometimes actually it's a blessing. It's a blessing to have a child still. Yeah, good. And there is was actually inspiration because you are doing, per se, being active and doing a lot of things despite of having the responsibility that you have. That's amazing. That's amazing. That's good. It's good. It's good to have you with us, Estelle. Okay.
Thank you.
Let's see. Dr. Dalia, do you have any comment?
Just want to just quickly build on what
Yes,
Alethea mentioned, that if you speak to a lot of indigenous communities, so they would say that their practices really goes way back, and actually this so-called modern, state institutions, for example, they are more recent, considering the long human history. So I think recalling what a lot of our ancestors have been doing in the past is one way of doing it, maybe at the risk of being impractical again and being very vague. But personally, I think we recognize these ontologies and epistemologies, but we can also start with really personal intellectual humility, that we don't know everything, so we can use different methodologies such as the listening to nature, as Alethea mentioned. But then again, I understand that a lot of research are very positivist and very linear as well. So I think, yeah, it's also a challenge for me to really put into practice some of these concepts.
That's great. Thank you, Dalia. I think this is good. Any more comments? We have 1 minute before our conclusion. That's good. That's good. Well, thank you to all our brilliant panelists and to everyone who joined us today across different time zones. And the cow, thank you for joining us, and also Estelle, baby. That's good to have you. That's that's good. That's very good. And I'm sending you Kandandu. Kandandu in my native language is hag. I'm sending you hag. Thank you for joining us. Today's discussion has highlighted an important evolution in peace building scholarship and practice. Rather than treating the environment as merely a source of conflict, or treating the environment as merely a source of conflict or resource to be managed, our panelists have shown that ecological systems are deeply intertwined with the experience of violence, recovery, justice, and reconciliation. So there is an intertwine. So we are connected with nature. From campesino practice of care and territorial restoration in Colombia to natural resources governance, challenges and opportunities in the Central African Republic, to broader theoretical reflections on ecological relationality, we have seen a shared call to expand how understand peace building itself. Several themes emerged repeatedly. Number one, peace building must account for ecological harms alongside human harms. Local communities possess vital environmental knowledge that should inform post-conflict recovery. Justice and reconciliation process may need to move beyond exclusively human-centered frameworks. Effective environmental governance can contribute to not only to sustainability, but also to social cohesion and durable peace. Climate change makes these questions increasingly urgent for conflict-affected societies worldwide. Collectively, these contributions encourage us to think of peace not simply as the absence of violence among people, but as the cultivation of more just and sustainable relationships among people, communities, institutions, and the environment upon which they depend. Thank you to all panelists and audience, Candando, for contributing to this important conversation on the frontiers on environmental peace building. Thank you.
Thank you, Octavio. Thank you, Alethea.